On March 24th, 1985, 5 men got into their vehicles and drove to a clubhouse in Lennoxville, Quebec. They weren't meeting strangers. They weren't walking into hostile territory. They were going to see people they already knew. For members of the Hells Angels, a clubhouse wasn't a dangerous place. It was where problems were discussed, rules were enforced, and business was handled face to face. If you were invited to a meeting, it meant one thing. You were expected to show up. And they did. They arrived unarmed. They didn't bring protection. They didn't tell anyone they were afraid, because there was no reason to be. What they didn't know was that the meeting they were walking into wasn't a meeting at all. It was the last place they would ever be seen alive. 5 men entered that clubhouse expecting routine. None of them walked back out. To understand why those 5 men didn't hesitate, you have to understand the world they were living in, and the rules they believed governed it. Inside the Hells Angels, danger was expected. Violence wasn't unusual, but it was supposed to come from outside the club, not from within it. Rival gangs were a threat. Police were a threat. People who owed money were a threat. Your own chapter wasn't. A clubhouse wasn't neutral ground. It wasn't just a building. It was a controlled space. Meetings happened there because meetings were supposed to be safe, at least for members in good standing. You didn't walk in expecting ambush. You walked in expecting discipline, discussion, or instruction. And that mattered, because if the rules worked the way members believed they did, there was no reason to refuse an invitation. Refusing would raise questions. Showing up was how loyalty was demonstrated. Hierarchy was everything. Orders flowed down, not up. Questions were discouraged. Trust was assumed. If leadership wanted to see you, you went. Not because you were reckless, but because that was how the system functioned. And that system had worked for years. Members were punished internally, but punishment usually meant fines, demotions, or patch removal. Sometimes violence happened, but it was targeted, contained, and meant to send a message. It wasn't supposed to erase people completely. That's the key assumption the 5 men carried with them. They believed that even if there was a problem, it would be handled within known boundaries. A confrontation maybe, a reckoning, but not elimination. And from their perspective, that belief made sense. They weren't defectors. They weren't informants. They weren't rivals. They were members. Which meant they believed one thing above all else. Whatever was happening, it would still follow the rules. What they didn't know was that those rules had already changed, not publicly, officially, or quietly. While they continued operating under the old assumptions, leadership elsewhere had begun seeing the situation differently. The question was no longer whether the rules protected everyone equally. It was whether some members had become a liability. And once that idea took hold, the meaning of safety inside the clubhouse changed completely. But the men driving to Lennoxville that day had no way of knowing that. They followed the rules they'd always followed. They trusted the structure they'd always trusted. They believed the danger was somewhere else. That belief is what brought them through the door. By the early 1980s, the Hells Angels in Quebec weren't just a biker club anymore. They were an organization with territory, money, and expectations. And like any organization that grows, not everyone grew at the same pace. The Laval-based North Chapter was one of those problems. From the outside, nothing about them looked unusual. They wore the same patch, rode under the same name, showed up to the same events. But internally, their reputation was changing, quietly, and not in their favor. Other chapters began raising concerns, not accusations exactly, more like complaints. Whispers that the Laval members were sloppy, that they were using too much of their own product, that money wasn't moving the way it was supposed to. In an organization built on control and profit, that kind of talk mattered. Cocaine wasn't just a drug. It was inventory. It was leverage. It was revenue that flowed upward through a carefully balanced structure. When members dipped into it for personal use, they weren't just breaking a rule. They were destabilizing the system. And according to leadership, that's what the Laval chapter was doing. They were seen as undisciplined, unreliable, a risk. What made it worse was the timing. The Hells Angels in Quebec were in the middle of a transition. Leadership was pushing for tighter control, cleaner operations, and less behavior that drew attention from police or rival groups. Chapters that couldn't adapt were no longer just embarrassing, they were dangerous. The Laval chapter didn't see it that way. From their perspective, they were operating the same way they always had. The rules hadn't been rewritten in any meeting they attended. No one had told them their standing was in jeopardy. As far as they knew, they were still members in good standing. But elsewhere, the conversation had already shifted. The issue wasn't whether the Laval chapter had broken rules. It was whether they could be trusted to follow them going forward. And that's a different question, because once trust is gone, discipline stops being corrective. It becomes preventative. The goal is no longer to fix the problem. It's to remove the possibility of it happening again. Inside leadership circles, the Laval chapter wasn't discussed as 5 individuals with flaws. They were discussed as a unit, a chapter, a weak link. And weak links don't get warnings. They get dealt with. The men in Laval never heard those conversations. They weren't present when the language changed. They didn't know they were being reclassified, from members to liabilities. By the time the invitation to Lennoxville was sent, the outcome had already been debated, weighed, and decided somewhere else. The meeting wasn't about addressing a problem. It was about ending one. According to trial evidence, the summons came from Réjean Lessard, the president of the Lennoxville chapter at the time. Messages were passed. A meeting was scheduled. The Laval chapter was told to come to the Hells Angels Clubhouse in Lennoxville. No explanation was offered. None was required. That wasn't unusual. When chapter leadership called, you showed up. So they did. The 5 men were Guy Louis Adam, known within the club as Chop, Jean-Guy Geoffrion, known as Brutus, Laurent Viau, often called L'Anglais, Michel Meyrand, known as Willie, and Jean-Pierre Mathieu. On March 24, 1985, these 5 members of the Laval chapter got on their bikes and into their vehicles and made the drive to Lennoxville. It wasn't a long trip. Nothing about it felt different from any other meeting they had attended before. They didn't bring weapons. They didn't bring backup. They didn't act like men walking into danger, because the rules they lived by told them they weren't. If there was a problem, this was how it would be handled. In person, behind closed doors, within the structure. Whatever was coming, they believed it would stay within the boundaries they understood. That belief shaped everything about how they arrived. They came together, not spread out. They didn't check the area. They didn't hesitate at the door. They were members in good standing, responding to a call from their own organization. What they couldn't see was that the space they were walking into had already been prepared. Members from other chapters were already inside, not to talk, not to negotiate. They were there to carry out a decision that had been made days, possibly weeks, earlier. The invitation wasn't meant to start a conversation. It was meant to bring everyone into one place. That's what made it effective. No chase, no public confrontation, no chance for misunderstanding. Just 5 men following the rules they believed still applied, walking into a place they trusted, surrounded by people they assumed were bound by the same loyalties. The door closed behind them, and at that moment, whether they understood it or not, the outcome was already sealed. Because the invitation had never been about a meeting. It was how the organization made sure no one would walk away. What happened next didn't unfold as a confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voices, no attempt to explain or justify what was about to happen. The men from the Laval chapter stepped inside the clubhouse and realized almost immediately that something was wrong. Members from other chapters were already there, too many of them, and they weren't there to listen. This wasn't a meeting. It was an execution. The violence was sudden and controlled. The men were overpowered before they could react. There was no chance to fight back, no opportunity to escape. This wasn't about settling a dispute or sending a warning. It was about removal. Each action followed the same logic that had shaped the decision itself: efficiency, certainty, finality. The killings weren't chaotic. They weren't fueled by rage. They were carried out with the kind of calm that only comes when the outcome has already been accepted by everyone involved. Within minutes, it was over. 5 members of the Laval chapter were dead inside a clubhouse they had believed was safe. And just as quickly as the violence began, it ended. There was no celebration, no lingering. The people who carried out the order didn't stay to reflect on what they'd done. They moved on to the next step, because the killings were only part of the plan. What mattered just as much was what came after, making sure the men who had just been killed didn't exist anymore, at least not in any way that would disrupt the organization. Inside the clubhouse, the rules had been enforced in the most absolute way possible, and outside of it, the world still had no idea anything had happened. What happened inside the clubhouse was violent, but it was brief. What followed was slower, more deliberate, and in many ways, more revealing. Once the killings were over, there was no confusion about what needed to happen next. This wasn't a crime scene in the traditional sense. It wasn't a place where people fled or panicked or made mistakes. Everyone involved knew their role. The bodies were wrapped carefully, placed into sleeping bags, and weighed down. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was improvised. This part of the plan had been thought through just as thoroughly as the invitation itself. Vehicles were prepared, routes were chosen. The goal wasn't just to move the bodies. It was to make sure they wouldn't be found quickly, if at all. The St. Lawrence River was chosen for a reason. It was vast, it was cold, and it had erased evidence before. The bodies were transported away from Lennoxville and dumped into the water, weighted so they would sink. The expectation was simple. Time and distance would do the rest. Back at the clubhouse, the space was cleaned. Any sign of what had just happened was removed. Blood was washed away. Surfaces were wiped down. By the time it was finished, there was nothing to suggest that 5 men had been killed there only hours earlier. And then, the organization returned to normal. No alarms were raised. No public reaction followed. No one reported anything out of the ordinary. For days, then weeks, the 5 men were simply missing. From the outside, it looked like disappearances. Adults who had last been seen going about their business and then vanished. There were no immediate witnesses, no crime scene, and no obvious point of violence. Exactly as planned. It wasn't until bodies began to surface that the truth started to emerge. As remains were recovered from the river, police realized they weren't dealing with unrelated incidents. The disappearances were connected, the victims were connected, and the circumstances pointed inward, not outward. But even then, progress was slow. The Hells Angels closed ranks. No one talked. Club members denied knowledge. The code of silence held. Investigators ran into the same barrier over and over again. People who knew what had happened, but had no intention of saying so. It took time, and eventually, insiders, for the case to move forward. Former members began to cooperate. Details surfaced. Names were provided. The outline of what had happened in Lennoxville finally became clear. By the time charges were laid and convictions followed, the organization had already absorbed the shock internally. The chapter was gone. The problem, as leadership had defined it, had been eliminated. The legal system would eventually catch up. Trials would be held. Sentences would be handed down. But the most important outcome had already been achieved. The organization had demonstrated unmistakably what happened when rules were no longer enough, and enforcement became absolute. For a long time, it looked like the plan had worked exactly as intended. The chapter was gone, the organization kept moving, and the 5 men who had disappeared were spoken about only quietly, if at all. They were full members of the Laval-based North Chapter. They weren't outsiders. They weren't rivals. They were insiders, men who believed they were protected by the same rules they had lived under for years. Eventually, the silence broke. As bodies were recovered from the St. Lawrence River and former members began cooperating with police, investigators were able to piece together what had happened inside the Lennoxville clubhouse. What emerged was not a spontaneous crime, but a coordinated internal purge. Multiple Hells Angels members were arrested and charged, including senior figures involved in planning and authorization. Among them was Réjean Lessard, the president of the Lennoxville chapter at the time. His role was central. Prosecutors argued that the killings were not only known to leadership, but approved and facilitated at that level. The trials confirmed what investigators had suspected. This wasn't a fight that escalated. It wasn't a breakdown of discipline. It was discipline. Several members were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The court accepted that the killings were deliberate, organized, and carried out as part of an internal enforcement decision. On paper, accountability had been delivered, but the broader outcome told a different story. The convictions did not dismantle the Hells Angels. They didn't fracture the organization or weaken its hold in Quebec. Instead, Lennoxville became a turning point. Inside the club, the message was unmistakable. Authority would be enforced, discipline would be absolute, and internal problems would be resolved permanently. After Lennoxville, the Hells Angels became more centralized and more controlled. Chapters understood that loyalty wasn't symbolic, it had consequences. The 5 men who were killed were erased from the organization's future, but their deaths reshaped it. Lennoxville did not damage the club, it taught it exactly how to survive. What happened in Lennoxville wasn't a breakdown of control, it was control taken to its furthest point. Quiet, deliberate, and final. The men responsible were eventually identified. Arrests were made, convictions followed. On paper, justice was delivered. But the larger outcome was different. The Hells Angels didn't fracture or disappear. They adapted. Lennoxville became a lesson inside the organization, proof of how discipline would be enforced going forward. The 5 men never knew the rules had changed. They walked into a place they believed was safe, surrounded by people they trusted. And the organization that killed them didn't collapse. It learned how to survive and thrive. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for listening to episode 30.
One reason this case stands out is how closely it resembles what happened years later in the Shedden Massacre. Different club, different province, different decade, but the same internal logic.
In both cases, members weren't caught in disputes with rivals. They were summoned by their own organization, under the assumption that internal matters would be handled internally. The violence wasn't impulsive. It was planned, contained, and meant to resolve what leadership defined as a problem.
That parallel isn't about imitation. It's about how these organizations function when discipline is no longer considered sufficient. Leah, what does that comparison tell you?
It tells me this isn't about personalities or isolated moments. It's about structure. When you remove the names and locations, the process is the same. Leadership identifies a liability, decides it can't be managed, and removes it in a way that prevents resistance or uncertainty. The violence isn't expressive, it's administrative. The objective isn't punishment or deterrence. It's finality.
That administrative quality is what people often miss. These weren't acts meant to provoke fear outside the organization or escalate conflict. They were meant to be quiet and decisive. Once someone was categorized as a risk, the response became procedural. The legal system eventually intervened. Arrests were made, trials followed, but in both cases the organizations themselves continued. Individuals were removed. The structure remained.
And that's why these cases feel so stark.
There's no misunderstanding at the center of them. The people who were killed didn't misread a situation. They were excluded from a decision that had already been finalized. By the time anything felt wrong, there was nothing left to respond to.
That isn't tragedy in a dramatic sense. It's consequence.
These weren't organizations losing control. They were enforcing it.
Lennoxville showed what that looks like. Shedden confirmed it wasn't isolated. If you want to find out what happened in the Shedden Biker Massacre in Ontario, listen to episode 19 of our podcast for more details.
Is there anything else you want to bring up before we end the episode?
Before we wrap up, if you're finding value in these conversations, take a moment to follow or subscribe to Northern Dark. It helps the show reach more listeners and allows us to keep doing this work carefully and responsibly.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time. Until then, take care of each other.